Welcome to the All Out Leadership Podcast, hosted by Pastor Eric Lawson, where each episode is uniquely designed to help you live all out by bringing you practical leadership from a biblical perspective delivered in 10 minutes or less. So whether you're a business leader, serving in ministry, or simply looking to grow in your leadership, this podcast is for you. Before we dive into this week's topic, make sure to subscribe to the podcast and download the show notes at ericlawson.com/podcast. And while you're at it, feel free to share the content on social media. Now, let's join Pastor Eric for this week's conversation.
Welcome to another edition of the All Out Leadership Podcast. So glad you are joining us. We're going to be talking about methods that need to change. Over time, methods have to change. And we learn inside of the life of David a great lesson how he was willing and flexible to change the methods of how he went to battle. 2 Samuel chapter 5, verse 17. Now, when the Philistines had heard that they had anointed David king over Israel, all the Philistines went up to search for David, and David heard of it, and he went down to the stronghold. Now, there's always going to be an attack of the enemy in one way or another when God's doing great victories. When God moves, you can always expect the enemy to move in as well. What we're going to see in the story of David that takes place, he goes down to the stronghold and he prays and he seeks God for a strategy, which is always wise. Just because the enemy's coming at you doesn't mean you just react in the flesh. A lot of times we fight the wrong battle or we fight it the wrong way because we didn't seek God and get his direction. So we're going to look at the importance of changing. 2 Samuel chapter 5, verse 19, so David inquired of the Lord, saying, "Shall I go up against the Philistines? Will you deliver them into my hands?" And the Lord said to David, "Go up, I will doubtlessly deliver the Philistines into your hands." So David goes up, God directs him. Now, after he wins this victory, the Philistines, they kind of regalvanize and they come back and attack him again. And so David does something very wise. He doesn't go, you know what, we won that battle, we're going to win this next one too. He seeks God again. 2 Samuel chapter 5, 22. Then the Philistines went up again and deployed themselves in the valley of Rephaim. Therefore David inquired of the Lord and said, "You shall not go up, but circle around behind them and come upon them in front of the mulberry trees. And it shall be when you hear the sound of the marching in the tops of the mulberry trees, then you shall advance quickly. For then the Lord will go out before you to strike the camp of the Philistines." Now, had David just gone out and did the same thing the same way because it worked before, he would have been defeated. But because he sought God, he was open to a new strategy, which is interesting because I would have never stopped to think, man, when I hear angels marching in the top of the mulberry trees, then it's time to go move forward with that strategy. We would have never come up with that, but God gave him a unique divine battle strategy. It's important that we're continually seeking God and listening to times we need to pivot in our methodology. 52% of Fortune 500 companies from the year 2000 are extinct today. 52% of Fortune 500 companies in 3 years are extinct. In less than 2 decades, more than 50% of the brands that were on the Fortune 500 list in 2000 are no longer in existence today. Listen to this. 52 years ago, the life expectancy of a Fortune 500 brand was 75 years. Now it's less than 15. Why is that? Because it's the saying, and it's a cliche because it's true. The things that got you here aren't the things that will keep you here. I highly encourage you to read or reread the book Built to Last. To me, that's just kind of one of those staple books that leaders should be periodically pulling out and at least reading the things you highlighted in it to continually be reminded of the need to change. Some of the greatest companies that used to be names in the households every day are no longer in existence. And this is also true inside of the church space. Church leaders also have to be willing to be flexible and adapt. And the danger that happens is this: we confuse the message with the method. The message is timeless. That will never change, should never change, and the Bible has many warnings against those who would add to God's word or take away from God's word. We don't change the message to be culturally relevant. No, it is culturally relevant, and if it doesn't line up with culture, we use the Bible to change culture, not culture to change the Bible. That's timeless, doesn't change because God himself never changes. However, the methodologies as leaders in how we're communicating the gospel, delivering the gospel, the tools of technology that are available to us, we must continually be adapting so we can be more effective at communicating the gospel. And in fact, so many churches get afraid of technology, they get afraid of change, that they're missing out in some unbelievable ways to adapt. As a church, we were already pretty heavily in an online experience where we were realizing there's so many people around the world who need a church experience, or they're on vacation and they want to stay connected to their church. So we were already working to have a good online presence. Then COVID hit. All of a sudden, many churches found out, hey, if we can't do church in the normal traditions inside the four walls in a brick and mortar environment, how do we can still continue to be the church and do church? And so there were a lot of churches that got hurt because they weren't adapting and harnessing technology that was available to them to make them more effective. And so many had to rush to get online and get that going. And thank God many successfully have done that. But unfortunately, there's some churches that are no longer in existence because they weren't able to adapt and adopt modern technology and methodology that continued to keep them relevant. The Bible's always relevant, God's always relevant, but we as leaders must keep our congregations and our businesses relevant to stay on the cutting edge, because that's where we need to be. Hey, Pony Express used to be an incredible way to get mail delivered. But thank God that things evolved into Federal Express, then it evolved into email, and then it evolved into Zoom and Zoom meetings. Churches and leaders who fail to continually adapt and adopt will ultimately, unfortunately, become extinct. We learned from David that when the enemy comes in, you do seek God, and you have to be willing to adapt and adopt and be flexible to change.
Thank you for joining us on the All Out Leadership Podcast. We hope you gained new biblical insight that challenged you to grow in your leadership. If you've enjoyed this week's episode, we would love your help in getting the content out farther. You can help by subscribing to the podcast at ericlawson.com/podcast and telling others about it. Next week, Pastor Eric will be back with another episode. So until then, we hope you have a great week being an all-out leader.